There was a moment in our early history when the freedoms that we take for granted today, speech, dissent, even the right to argue with our government, came under direct attack. And it didn't come from the King George or Parliament. It came from one of our own founding fathers. And the man who once was his friend, fellow founder, stood up to stop it. He was quiet, bookish, deliberate, and armed only with the Constitution. This is defending the Republic. Thank you for being here. If you care about preserving the real stories of American history and the moments our republic stood on the edge, hit subscribe and tap the bell so we can keep this history alive. So today, we revisit 1798 when James Madison quietly fought to save the First Amendment. See, in every generation, there comes a moment when fear tempts a nation to silence itself. When leaders begin to see criticism as a threat, and liberty starts to look expendable. This story reminds us that freedom survives not by accident, but because someone takes a stand and chooses to defend it. The United States in 1798 was barely a decade old, fragile, divided, and still figuring out what it meant to be a nation. Across the Atlantic, France was seizing American ships. Rumors of spies spread through the cities. Parties accused each other of treason, and fear settled over the country. The type of fear that has always been liberty's most dangerous enemy. So John Adams, he was no villain. He was a leading patriot from Boston that designated Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence and was in the room crafting the Constitution. He risked everything for independence. But the presidency can bend even the strongest minds. And in 1798, as the second president, he was overwhelmed. He feared America might collapse into chaos. He feared the country was too weak to survive a foreign attack and domestic division at the same time. And he trusted a Congress full of a new political party called Federalist, urging him to silence dissent. So when they placed a stack of new laws on his desk, laws that expanded presidential authority just to crush his opponents, Adams signed them. The man who once warned against centralized power now wielded it. The Alien Acts gave the president sweeping power to deport non-citizens without a trial, without evidence, simply for being from a country we were at war or likely to be at war with. But the Sedition Act was the most dangerous because it made a federal crime to criticize the president or Congress with anything they deemed false, scandalous, or malicious. So, newspapers were shut down, editors were jailed, ordinary citizens intimidated. A sitting member of Congress, Matthew Lyon, was thrown in prison for criticizing Adams. The same generation that had fought for the right to speak freely against a king was now jailing Americans for speaking freely against the president. James Madison saw the danger instantly. He had written much of the Constitution, and he knew its faults, its limits, its vulnerabilities. And he knew that if the Alien and Sedition Acts survived unchallenged, the First Amendment would become little more than a decoration, admired but powerless. And he also knew that speaking out could put him at risk. So Madison did what he did best. He retired to a quiet room in Virginia, took up his pen, and wrote the Virginia Resolutions, which argued for a simple constitutional truth. The federal government has limits. It cannot define the scope of its own power, and when it oversteps, the people and the states must resist, peacefully, constitutionally, but firmly. Madison risked prosecution under the very law he opposed. Federalists called him disloyal, a traitor, dangerous, but he held the line. and the country finally pushed back. Debates grew louder. The public grew uneasy with jailing citizens for speaking their minds, and the foundation of our nation had cracked. But it hadn't broken. You know, it's worth remembering just how rare this moment was in world history. Most revolutions don't end in stability. They collapse into chaos. France descended into terror. Russia into civil war. New nations across the 20th century fractured before they ever found their footing. And by 1798, we were much closer to that fate than we like to remember. The Alien and Sedition Acts had turned neighbors into enemies, newspapers into weapons. The air was electric with suspicion. We like to imagine our early years were steady and unified, but they weren't. We were trembling on a knife's edge. Hello, everybody. I want to take a break and remind that today's episode is sponsored by Map Media and Reviving Our Republic. The heroes of yesterday will light the path for the heroes we need today. Learn more at revivingourrepublic.com. Now, let's get back to the episode. And then came the election of 1800, one of the most bitter, dangerous, and tightly contested elections in American history. The voters spoke, and the unthinkable happened. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, a perfect deadlock. Adams, the sitting president, had finished third, so he was out. But the tie between Jefferson and Burr threw the entire system into crisis. And under the Constitution, a tie meant only one thing. The decision went to the House of Representatives, controlled by Adams' Federalists, who hated Jefferson. What followed was a political standoff that lasted 7 excruciating days. The House voted once, twice, 10 times, 20 times, still no winner. Ballot after ballot, 35 times the House deadlocked. The young republic inched toward the abyss. Foreign diplomats predicted violence. Governors quietly prepared militias. Some feared the Union would simply just come apart and fall apart. And then the 36th ballot. A handful of Federalists abstained. The deadlock cracked. Thomas Jefferson became president, while Aaron Burr became vice president because he came in second. We survived, barely. And America witnessed the first peaceful transfer of power between 2 rival parties in American history. With Jefferson in power, those imprisoned under the Sedition Act were pardoned. The Sedition Act expired in 1801, and the Alien Acts faded away. And Madison's courage became visible for what it was. A defense of liberty when liberty was fragile. A defense of dissent when dissent was dangerous. And a defense of the Constitution when the Constitution could not yet defend itself. When we look back on 1798, we see a moment when fear tempted a nation to silence itself, and a man who refused to let that happen. James Madison didn't save free speech with an army. He saved it with intention, a pen, and constitutional courage. So what do you think? Let me know your thoughts on how Adams could turn against free speech so quickly, and the temptations of centralized power, and how it could ruin liberty for America. Let's have a real conversation on presidential limits. And until next time, place, purpose, preservation, revive the republic.